Morning, June 9, 721. Outside the walls of Toulouse, in the Duchy of Aquitaine, the air would have carried the quiet sounds of a siege that had gone on too long. Horses shifted in the dust beyond the city, fires burned low in the Umayyad camp, and men who had slept in armour listened for the familiar noises from the walls. For the soldiers of Al-Sam ibn Malik, Toulouse looked trapped. The city was surrounded, its defenders were tired, and the road into Aquitaine seemed close enough to touch. Medieval writers later gave numbers no careful historian can accept literally, but even without legend, the imbalance was real. A major Umayyad expeditionary force stood outside one of southern Gaul's most important cities, while Duke Odo gathered what men he could from a threatened frontier. If Toulouse fell, the danger would not stop at one city. The Garonne Valley could open. Aquitaine could be broken. The western edge of Christian Gaul could change before Charles Martel ever became famous at Tours. This battle changed the Umayyad advance into Aquitaine forever, and if you stay with me, you'll see how an army that came to surround a city suddenly found itself surrounded in return. To understand why Toulouse mattered, we have to begin 10 years earlier, across the Pyrenees. In 711, the old Visigothic kingdom in Spain collapsed with shocking speed. What had seemed like a settled Christian kingdom became, in just a few years, the new frontier province of Al-Andalus, tied to the wider Umayyad Caliphate that stretched far beyond the western Mediterranean. The conquest did not mean every town fell the same way, or that every region was controlled with the same strength, but the direction of power had clearly changed. Armies that had crossed from North Africa into Iberia now had bases, commanders, tax systems, garrisons, and roads from which they could look north. The Pyrenees were a barrier, but not a wall against ambition. Beyond them lay Septimania, the old coastal region of southern Gaul, with Roman roads, port cities, and opportunities for both plunder and control. Narbonne was the key. When Narbonne fell to Umayyad forces around 719 or 720, it became more than a captured city. It became a forward base on the northern side of the mountains. From there, cavalry could ride into nearby country. Supplies could be gathered, and larger operations could be planned. Any campaign toward Toulouse now had a place to begin. Toulouse was not just another city on a map. It sat in a region where old Roman importance, Visigothic memory, and Aquitanian power met. Whoever held Toulouse had influence over the Garonne Valley, and the Garonne was one of the natural routes into southwestern Gaul. A force that captured Toulouse could threaten deeper Aquitaine. A force that failed there would leave a warning behind. On the Aquitanian side stood Duke Odo, also known as Eudes. It is tempting to introduce him like a king in a legend, but that would miss the reality of his position. Odo was a ruler under pressure. He had to act on a frontier where messages arrived late, loyalties shifted, and danger came from more than one direction. To his south, Umayyad power had crossed the Pyrenees. To his north, the Franks were growing stronger under Charles Martel, a man whose authority Odo could not simply ignore. So Odo's world was not simple. He was not only defending a city from an invader, he was trying to preserve the independence of Aquitaine between two expanding forces. That is what makes his decision at Toulouse so important. He did not answer the crisis by locking himself into one doomed posture. He moved. He searched for men. He gathered help from Aquitaine and the Gascon lands. He prepared to fight not just with courage, but with timing. Across from him stood Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Hawlani, Governor-General of Al-Andalus. He was not merely a raider riding north for a quick strike. Under his authority, Al-Andalus was being organized more firmly after the conquest of Spain. Land, tribute, command, and military expansion all mattered. When Al-Samd moved toward Toulouse, he did so from a position of real power. He had already seen Narbonne become an Umayyad foothold. He had the confidence of a commander operating from a newly conquered but active military province. He brought an army north and he chose siege. That decision tells us a great deal. A raid can burn, take, and leave. A siege is different. A siege says the target is worth time. It requires men to stay in place, to guard supply lines, to build or operate engines, to watch the walls, and to wait through hunger, boredom, sickness, and weather. It can break a city, but it can also trap the besieger in a pattern. Every day the army looks inward at the walls. It risks forgetting the roads beyond the camp. The sources for Toulouse are not as full as we would like. Later accounts inflated the numbers and turned the battle into something almost impossible in scale. We should be careful with that. The old writers wanted moral meaning, and sometimes they expressed meaning through huge figures. What we can say with confidence is stronger because it is simpler. A major Umayyad army besieged Toulouse. Odo returned with a relief force. Al-Sam's army was badly defeated, and Al-Sams himself was mortally wounded. For the people inside Toulouse, the politics of all this may have felt far away. They did not need a map of the caliphate or a study of Frankish power to understand danger. They could see the tents beyond the walls. They could hear the work of men preparing siege equipment. They could feel the pressure of waiting while food stores shrank and rumours moved faster than truth. A city under siege becomes a world of closed gates and narrowed choices. Every sound outside matters. Every delay feels like abandonment. For Odo, the stakes were regional and personal at once. If he failed, he would not only lose a city. He could lose the trust of the men who followed him, the defensive spine of his duchy, and the fragile authority that kept Aquitaine from being swallowed by stronger powers. For Al-Samj, victory would prove that Umayyad arms could move from Iberia into Gaul and hold ground beyond the mountains. Toulouse was the prize because it offered more than wealth. It offered direction. That is why the siege became one of the most important confrontations before the better-known Battle of Tours 11 years later. Before Charles Martel became the name most Americans recognize, Odo of Aquitaine faced a major Umayyad army outside Toulouse. And to understand how he beat it, we have to look not only at the men, but at the ground beneath them. Toulouse stands beside the Garonne River, and that fact mattered. Rivers in early medieval warfare were not just scenery. They shaped roads, supply routes, settlement, trade, and the movement of armies. The Garonne Valley opened a route through southwestern Gaul. If an army could control Toulouse, it could influence the lands around that river and threaten the interior of Aquitaine. A city like that did not have to be the richest place in Europe to be worth fighting over. It only had to sit where movement became power. The old city also had defensive value. Toulouse had deep Roman and Visigothic roots, and although its defences in 721 cannot be reconstructed in every detail, it was not an open village waiting to be walked through. It had walls, gates, streets, and defenders who understood that surrender would change everything. For Al-Sam, taking the city required pressure. For Odo, saving it required more than bravery. He needed to break the logic of the siege. A siege army has a strange weakness. It looks powerful because it surrounds the target, but it must divide its attention in too many directions. Some men face the walls, some guard the camp, some watch the roads, some care for animals. Some move supplies, some build or protect siege equipment. The commander must think about the city in front of him and the open country behind him. If he fails at either task, the shape of the battle can reverse. That was the military meaning of Toulouse. The Umayyad army could not simply stare at the walls and assume the rest of the world had disappeared. Its supply line reached back toward Narbonne and the route to Septimania. Its camp had to function like a temporary town, full of tents, horses, tools, carts, food, water, wounded men, guards, and command spaces. A camp like that could support a siege. It was not idle ground for sudden close fighting. The Umayyad force was likely made up of troops from the Arab-Berber military world of Al-Andalus. There would have been cavalry, useful for scouting, raiding, screening movement, and pursuit. There would have been infantry for camp defence and siege work. Next, there may have been men skilled in operating or building siege equipment, because a serious attempt against Toulouse required more than a line of horsemen outside the walls. Spears, swords, shields, bows, javelins, and other light weapons belonged to that world of warfare. The army was mobile, experienced, and confident from years of expansion. Odo's force was different. It was drawn from Aquitaine and probably from Gascon lands as well, a regional army fighting close to home. It may not have looked as uniform as the Umayyad expeditionary force. Some men would have had good mail or helmets. Others would have carried simpler shields, spears, axes, knives, and bows. Mounted nobles and retainers could deliver shock at key moments, but much of the fighting would still depend on men moving on foot, holding together, and pushing into confusion without losing their nerve. Inside Toulouse, weapons were prepared with the knowledge that the walls might be the last safe line in the world. Spears were checked. Shields were brought close to the gates. Bowstrings had to be kept ready. Men looked down from the walls at the campfires and the movement below. It is easy to imagine fear there, but fear does not mean weakness. In a siege, fear can become discipline because the alternative is too clear. The Umayyad camp had its own rhythm. Men fed horses, repaired gear, guarded prisoners or supplies if any had been taken, and watched the walls for signs of collapse. The longer a siege continues, the more dangerous routine becomes. A soldier begins to believe the enemy inside is the only enemy that matters. A commander begins to read silence as success. A camp that should remain alert slowly starts to behave as if tomorrow will look exactly like yesterday. Religion also belonged to this world, but not in the flat way modern retellings sometimes make it. The men inside Toulouse would have understood the siege through Christian fear, prayer, and hope. Churches and clergy likely mattered in the emotional life of the city. Odo's men, marching to relieve Toulouse, would have carried not only weapons but the belief that they were defending their homes and their faith. On the Umayyad side, soldiers served within the political and religious order of the caliphate, where expansion, duty, reward, and faith could all be connected. Both sides believed their struggle had meaning. Both sides were made of human beings who could feel hunger, doubt, pride, and dread. Odo's key decision was simple to describe and terrible to make. He could not win by waiting forever behind walls. If he remained passive, Toulouse might starve or break under pressure. If he tried to fight too early, before gathering enough men, Al-Sam could crush him in the open. If he waited too long, he might return to find the city already taken. So Odo chose the dangerous middle path. He gathered a relief force and aimed to strike when the besiegers were fixed in place. That decision required patience. It also required a cold understanding of siege warfare. The besieger seems to control everything, but only while the surrounding space remains secure. If a relief army appears behind the camp, and if the defenders inside the city are still able to act, then the army around the walls can suddenly become the one under pressure. Odo did not need to defeat the Umayyads in a clean open field contest under perfect conditions. He needed to make their position impossible. Imagine that choice from his side. Every delay could look like cowardice. Every rumour from Toulouse could sound like accusation. Men inside the city may have wondered whether help was coming at all. Yet if Odo rushed, he would waste the only advantage he had. He needed the Umayyad army committed to the siege, stretched by routine, facing the city, and confident enough to be vulnerable. Al-Sam's decision was the opposite. He held his army in place and kept pressure on Toulouse. He had reason to believe time favoured him. Narbonne gave him a base. The city was isolated. The defenders could not endure forever. But in that confidence lay danger. A commander can do many things well and still lose because he misjudges one angle of the battlefield. At Toulouse, that angle was behind him. Before sunrise on June 9, the siege camp would have been waking into what many men expected to be another day of pressure. The first sounds were not yet battle sounds. They were small and ordinary. Leather creaking, horses blowing air through their noses, men speaking quietly, metal lifted from the ground, ashes stirred back into flame. The walls of Toulouse stood nearby, dark against the morning. Inside them, defenders waited with the tense patience of people who know they may have only one chance. The first shock did not come from the place the besiegers had been studying for so long. It came from outside the pattern. Odo's relief force approached the Umayyad position, and the exact details of its movement are lost to us, but the tactical picture is clear enough. He struck the army that had been built around the city. That meant he was not attacking a neat battle line on ground chosen for open combat. He was attacking a siege system with men, animals, supplies and equipment arranged for a different kind of war. By early morning, the first contact would have turned confusion into alarm. Men who had expected to look toward the walls now had to turn toward the rear or flank. Orders had to travel through a camp not prepared for calm maneuver. Some soldiers would have reached for shields before they understood the size of the danger. Others would have tried to find us, their horses, their banners, or the men of their own unit. In battle, confusion is not empty. It has sound. It is shouted in more than one direction. It is the ring of metal before a man knows where the blow is coming from. Odo's men had to move fast enough to exploit surprise, but not so fast that they broke apart. Aquitanian and Gascon fighters, carrying spears, shields, and swords, would have pushed toward the parts of the camp where pressure could do the most damage. Mounted men could strike at exposed points, but the battle could not be won by horses alone. Camps are cluttered. Tents, ropes, carts, cooking areas, animals and stacked supplies interrupt movement. Once fighting reaches such ground, it becomes close, uneven, and frighteningly personal. The Umayyad army was not helpless. It was a serious force led by an experienced commander. Men who had campaigned through Iberia and across the mountains did not forget how to fight because they were surprised. Some would have formed around leaders. Cavalrymen would have tried to create space. Archers and light troops could slow the attackers if they found room to work. The first minutes mattered because they determined whether Al-Sam's army could turn shock into order. As the morning widened, the defenders of Toulouse would have understood that something had changed. From the walls, they could see movement in the camp that did not look like ordinary siege activity. Dust rose in the wrong place. Men ran away from the city instead of toward it. Shouts carried over the ground. For a city that had been waiting behind closed gates, this was the moment when waiting became action. The defenders did not need to destroy the Umayyad army by themselves. Their role was to add pressure at the exact point when Al-Sam's men were already forced to respond to Odo. If they sallied from the gates or threatened a breakout, the tactical problem for the besiegers became much worse. The army around Toulouse now had to think in two directions. In front stood the city it had tried to break. Behind it came the relief force it had failed to stop. The circle had turned. That is the central shape of the Battle of Toulouse. It was not simply a heroic charge. It was a reversal of position. Al-Sam had come to hold the city in place, but Odo had forced him to defend the space between the city and the open road. The Umayyads had to protect their camp, keep men from panic, hold off the relief force, contain the defenders, and preserve a line of retreat. Each task made sense alone. Together, under surprise, they became almost impossible. By mid-morning, Al-Sam likely tried to restore control. We should not imagine him standing still while disaster unfolded. A commander in his position would have looked for a way to form a defensive line, secure his own command group, and create room for cavalry to move. He may have tried to pull men away from the walls and face Odo directly. Add to basket, he may have tried to hold the centre of the camp long enough to prevent a rout. Whatever the exact orders were, the need was obvious. Stop the battle from becoming many small battles at once. For a while, he may have succeeded in places. That matters. Real battles rarely collapse in one clean motion. One part of a line holds while another breaks. One group of men hears the order while another hears only screaming. A mounted unit pushes back attackers near one cluster of tents, while infantry near the wall begins to lose confidence. Victory and defeat can exist side by side for several terrible minutes, and no one on the ground can see the whole picture. The Umayyad cavalry would have been important here. Mounted men gave al-Sam the chance to answer pressure quickly, to strike exposed attackers, or to open a path through the chaos. But cavalry needs space. In a siege camp, space is not guaranteed. If horses have to move through tents, supply lines, wounded men, and panicked animals, their strength weakens. A horseman who cannot maneuver becomes another man trapped in disorder. Add hours passed, and the pressure did not release. Odo's men had not come to make a gesture. They had come to break the siege. The defenders inside Toulouse, still alive and still armed, added to the danger simply by existing as an active threat. Every Umayyad soldier near the walls had to wonder whether the gates would open behind him. Every soldier facing Odo had to wonder whether the line near the city was giving way. That kind of uncertainty does damage before the blade lands. Near noon, the battle would have become less about the original plan and more about survival. Al-Sam needed to keep his army from splitting into isolated groups. Odo needed to keep pressure on long enough for the Umayyad position to lose its shape. The defenders needed to act without rushing into a trap. None of these men were watching a battle map from above. They saw dust, shields, faces, and motion. They heard orders they might not understand. They smelled sweat, trampled earth, smoke from campfires, and the sharp fear of men too close together. This is where the geography of a siege matters again. The walls of Toulouse were not just a background. They formed one side of the trap. The camp that had been built to dominate those walls now became a burden. Siege equipment, supply wagons, animals and tents all marked the space where the Umayyads had expected to wait out a city. Once Odo's men came into that space, the tools of patience became obstacles. A commander can recover from surprise if he has time. Al-Sam did not have enough. He had to make quick decisions with incomplete information. Should he commit more men toward Odo and risk a breakout from Toulouse? Should he hold the walls and risk losing the camp? Should he order retreat before the army fully broke, or would that turn pressure into panic? These are not easy choices. They are the choices commanders face when the battlefield they prepared for has disappeared. In the hardest fighting, Al-Sam was wounded. The sources do not allow us to describe the wound with confidence, and a good historical script should not pretend otherwise. What matters is that the commander of the expedition fell at the very moment his army needed clear authority. A wounded commander is more than one casualty. He is the centre of orders, confidence, and direction. When that centre falters, every uncertain man becomes more uncertain. The effect would have moved through the army unevenly. Some men may not have known at first. Others may have heard rumours before the truth. In early medieval battle, rumour could be as dangerous as the enemy. The commander is wounded, the line is broken, the road is cut. Some of those statements might be wrong in the first moment, but men act on what they believe. Fear travels fast in a crowded camp. By early afternoon, the Umayyad effort to hold the siege positions was failing. The army no longer fought as a force confidently surrounding Toulouse. It fought as a force trying to escape a battlefield that had turned against it. Some units likely continued to resist with discipline. Others would have begun falling back. Men tried to save horses, protect comrades, recover banners, or simply move toward the road that led back to Narbonne. Defeat does not always mean everyone runs at once. Often it means order thins until only fragments remain. Odo's men had to be careful too. Pursuit is tempting, but pursuit can become disorder. A victorious army that scatters too widely may expose itself to counterattack. So the fighting after the break would have been uneven. There would have been pockets of resistance, desperate withdrawals, and sudden violence around equipment, animals, and paths out of the camp. The Aquitanians wanted to destroy the siege, but they also needed to preserve the victory. Later sources turned the slaughter into enormous numbers. We should not follow them blindly. It is enough to say the defeat was severe. The expedition had lost its commander. The siege had failed. The army that came to take Toulouse had been forced away from it. The psychological damage may have been as important as the dead. Umayyad power north of the Pyrenees had looked almost unstoppable to many people. At Toulouse it was stopped. By afternoon, the battle had entered its collapse. The Umayyad survivors who could withdraw moved back toward Narbonne, the base from which the campaign had grown. That retreat mattered. Narbonne was still in Umayyad hands, and that meant the frontier was not cleansed of danger. This was not the final end of Umayyad activity in southern Gaul. But for this campaign, at this city, on this day, the line had broken. As evening approached, the field outside Toulouse would have looked nothing like the confident siege camp of the morning. Tents had been torn, trampled, or abandoned. Horses moved riderless or lay dead where the fighting had trapped them. Shields and weapons lay in the dirt. Men searched for leaders, brothers, sons, and friends. The city still stood. That was the first and most visible result. For the defenders, the silence after battle may have been almost as difficult to understand as the noise. A city under siege learns to live with threat. When the threat breaks, relief does not arrive cleanly. It comes mixed with exhaustion, grief, disbelief, and the sight of the dead beyond the gates. Toulouse had survived, but survival left marks. The Umayyad retreat did not erase the wider danger. Narbonne remained a Muslim-held base in southern Gaul, and future raids and campaigns would continue. The road to Tours in 732 was not yet visible in every detail, but some of the same frontier pressures were already taking shape. Among the men connected to the wider Umayyad military world was Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, who would later become central to that better-known confrontation. Toulouse, in other words, was not the end of the story. It was one of the first great warnings. The immediate aftermath outside the city was brutal. In the practical way, all battlefields are brutal. There were bodies to bury, wounded men to care for, abandoned gear to gather, and rumours to sort from truth. Casualty numbers are unknown. Medieval accounts claimed astonishing losses, but modern historians treat those figures with caution. The reliable point is not the exact number. The reliable point is the scale of the defeat and the death of Alsam. Alsam's fate gave the battle its sharpest consequence. He had led the campaign into Aquitaine. He had placed Toulouse under siege. He had expected, with reason, that sustained pressure could bring the city down. Instead, he was mortally wounded and died after the battle, often associated with the retreat toward Narbonne. For an army operating far from its Iberian base, the loss of a governor and commander was not a small matter. It shook the campaign at its head. Odo emerged from the battle with a reputation transformed. He had not merely defended a city from behind walls. He had returned at the decisive moment and struck the besiegers where they were vulnerable. Later Christian memory would celebrate him as a defender of the faithful. And while that memory may simplify the politics, it reflects something real. In 721, before Charles Martel became the famous name in the story of resistance to Umayyad expansion, Odo won a major victory. Yet victory did not make Aquitaine safe forever. That is one of the most important parts of this story. Odo still ruled in a dangerous space between powers. The Umayyads remained in Narbonne. The Franks remained ambitious in the north. A battle can save a city and still leave a ruler surrounded by hard choices. Toulouse gave Odo time, prestige, and survival, but it did not give him peace. Strategically, the battle checked the Umayyad push into Aquitaine. Toulouse remained in Odo's hands, and the Garonne Valley did not immediately open to Alsam's army. That alone made the battle important. A successful capture of Toulouse could have changed the military shape of southern Gaul. Instead, the campaign ended with retreat, loss, and uncertainty. The long-term meaning is more subtle than the old phrase, saved Europe. That phrase is too large and too simple. Toulouse did not end Umayyad power in Gaul. It did not prevent all future campaigns. It did not make the frontier quiet, but it proved something that mattered deeply at the time. An Umayyad army north of the Pyrenees could be defeated if timing, terrain, and command decisions came together. It also showed the hidden danger of siege warfare. A siege army looks dominant because it surrounds the city, but domination depends on control of the surrounding ground. Once Odo appeared behind the besiegers, the walls of Toulouse became part of the battlefield in a new way. The city that Alsam meant to trap helped trap him. The army that faced inward suddenly had to turn outward, and in that turn, its strength began to fail. For viewers who know the Battle of Tours, Toulouse deserves a place before it. 11 years before 732, Odo of Aquitaine had already faced a major Umayyad force and won. His victory did not receive the same lasting fame as Charles Martel's, but it shaped the frontier that made later events possible. It reminded every commander on that border that conquest beyond the Pyrenees would not be simple. When we return to the first image of the morning, the story becomes clear. Toulouse seemed surrounded. Its defenders waited behind walls. The Umayyad camp looked like the instrument of inevitable victory. But war often turns on what a commander fails to watch. Alsam looked toward the city. Odo came from beyond the expected edge of the battle. Centuries later, the modern battlefield around Toulouse is quieter now, covered by roads, neighborhoods, and the ordinary sound of a living city. But beneath that calm remains the memory of the morning when a siege army looked toward the walls and never saw the counterattack coming.